Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Texas PTA Connect webinar, Empowering Parents and Students, Resources and Strategies to Combat Human Trafficking. My name is Melinda Samberson, and I am the VP of Programs and Resources for Texas PTA. I'm honored to facilitate this critical conversation. Before we get started, I want to introduce Jennifer Easley, Texas PTA President. Jennifer?
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Melinda, and the Texas PTA Programs and Resources Committee for gathering experts on this important and sensitive topic. I truly wish we didn't have to have this conversation, but unfortunately, the reality of sex trafficking continues to affect countless lives. I deeply appreciate you taking the time to be here today, as your involvement is crucial in raising awareness and driving change. Together, we can make a difference. So let's get started.
Jennifer, thank you for joining us today. Our goal is to empower parents and students with the information they need to recognize red flags, understand vulnerabilities, and take proactive steps to prevent and respond to human trafficking threats. Today, we're going to delve into the complex world of human trafficking. We'll define it, learn about the different types like sex and labor trafficking, and discuss why people fall victim to this terrible crime. Next, we'll learn to spot the signs of human trafficking, both online and in real life. And we'll talk about how to empower our young people to make smart choices and stay safe. Finally, we'll explore the resources available to help victims, survivors, and those seeking support. Also joining us today are 4 subject matter experts who will share their insights and answer your questions. Alicia Bush is the founder and executive director of Treasured Vessels Foundation, an anti-trafficking nonprofit based in Frisco, Texas, focused on restoring survivors of sexual exploitation. Alicia is an active advocate in the anti-trafficking community, a business owner and an author, wife, and mom of 5 children. Dr. Stephanie Cook currently serves as the Managing Director of Guidance and Counseling in Frisco ISD. With her experience as a therapist, school professional, and adjunct professor at SMU and Dallas Baptist University, Dr. Cook brings expertise in adolescent development, school safety, and school counseling. Joseph Scaramucci is the Director of Law Enforcement Training and Operations at Skull Games. He is a veteran law enforcement officer who led numerous sting operations, resulting in hundreds of arrests and the rescue of trafficking victims. He has advised and trained law enforcement agencies worldwide and contributed to legislative efforts to combat this heinous crime. You will meet our 4th panelist, Jennifer Biendo, in just a minute. In addition to her professional role, she has a master's degree in public affairs from the University of Texas at Austin and holds a certification in public health. She is also the proud mom of 2 school-age boys, including a high schooler who kind of wishes his mom had a normal job that didn't involve sex education. Panelists, thank you all for being here with us today. And for the audience, we hope you will actively participate in the discussion by submitting your questions through the webinar chat. Before we get to questions for our panelists, we want everyone to understand some of the myths versus the truths of human trafficking and what is covered in the secondary school's health curriculum. Jen Biendo created this video to help get us started.
My name is Jen Biendo, and I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Research for Healthy Futures of Texas. We're a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we work to support safe and healthy adolescents in Texas through equitable access to healthcare, education, and services. So today we'll be talking about how to provide healthy futures and safe futures for our Texas youth by preventing abuse and trafficking. So we like to start out by talking about some myths and some realities about human trafficking. If you're like me, you see a lot of information on your social media feed about human trafficking, but we know a lot of the narrative about human trafficking, and especially sex trafficking, just isn't true. So let's tackle a few of the most common myths that we hear. So one really common myth is that Most victims are unwillingly kidnapped or forced into human trafficking. They're snatched out of the grocery store parking lot. But what we actually see in reality is most victims are vulnerable young people who have been groomed in person or online and may even believe that they're willingly participated in being exploited. Most people who are perpetuating human trafficking or sexual exploitation don't want to deal with a victim who is resisting. They want someone who is pliable and who they can be sure will kind of go along with what they're doing. Similarly, it's a common myth that victims are being held through physical force and they would escape if they just had a chance. The reality is that victims may stay with the perpetrator for very complicated reasons. This could include things like financial vulnerability, immigration status vulnerability, or even a sense of love, even a belief that they're in a relationship. In fact, they may not even be aware that they're being exploited. They may think that they're with a boyfriend or a partner. A common myth is that sex trafficking is the most common form or even the only form of human trafficking in the US. But in reality, and we don't have very strong statistics on this, but it is likely that labor trafficking is actually more common than sex trafficking. So this could be things like forced domestic servitude. It could be working in salons or in a farm setting. So sex trafficking gets a lot of the oxygen in the room, but we know that labor trafficking is actually as common or potentially even more common. The narrative around sex trafficking and human trafficking often focuses on girls and on women, but boys and men can also be trafficking victims and frequently are. And then finally, there's the narrative that most traffickers are strangers. Again, perhaps that stranger who kidnapped someone out of the grocery store parking lot. But in reality, just like abusers, traffickers are typically known to their victims. They could even be their parents or their step-parents. They could be other relatives like a brother or an uncle, and they could even be boyfriends or other types of romantic partners. So let's turn to what our young people in Texas learn about trafficking within the context of the public education system. So, trafficking, as well as other education on healthy relationships, abuse prevention, and sexual health, are all part of our health education curriculum standards here in Texas. So, health education is an elective, and health education is required to be offered in our public and our charter schools at the elementary and the middle school level. However, it is an elective at the high school level, and it's not required for graduation in most school districts. So, as a result, many high school students never even take a health class, and in fact, we have a lot of districts that don't even offer a health class. However, the good news is that we have newly adopted health curriculum standards in Texas. And these new standards add key topics about health, including trafficking prevention, at the middle school level, when all of our students should be offered this content. So let's go back to these new health standards. So in November of 2020, for the first time since Titanic was in the movie theaters, our Texas State Board of Education updated the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills for Health Education, or the TEKS for short. And these new standards were required to go into effect in the 2022-23 school year. So what do these new standards include about human trafficking or sex trafficking? So one really important factor to start out in the sixth grade is that students learn about appropriate personal digital and online communication boundaries. This is really important because we know that our young people are online, and that represents a vulnerability where they can be exploited, manipulated, or groomed. In sixth grade, they learn to identify how technology can be used to recruit or manipulate potential victims of sex trafficking. And they learn more about abuse, about the physical and emotional and sexual abuse, and also exploitation that can constitute abuse. They identify the social and emotional impacts of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. And they list characteristics of unhealthy or harmful relationships, which is important because sex trafficking can occur in what young people may think is the context of a relationship. They identify ways of reporting suspected sexual abuse of themselves or of others, such as telling their parent or another trusted adult. And they learn how a healthy sense of self and making and respecting decisions about safe boundaries and limits can promote healthy relationships. We have even more content in the 7th or 8th grade, and you'll see that a lot of these standards scaffold on the things that students have already learned. So they learn about strategies and benefits for avoiding violence, gangs, weapons, and human trafficking. They expand on some of those prior standards that they learned in 6th grade about safe online behavior and identity protection. They learn more about how technology is used to recruit or manipulate potential victims of sex trafficking. They learn more about abuse and healthy relationships, and they identify protective strategies for avoiding unsafe situations that can contribute to things like abuse, assault, or sex trafficking. Again, they continue to learn about the importance of reporting or reaching out to a trusted adult. And they also learn more about the legal aspects of sexual activity about a minor, including things like the legal age of consent. In high school, a lot of this content is delivered in Health 1. Again, this is an elective class, so all students won't necessarily receive this content, but if they do enroll, they will formulate strategies for avoiding violence, gangs, weapons, and human trafficking. They'll identify appropriate responses to situations where their online safety is putting them at risk, including recognizing predators. And then they'll describe the characteristics of sex trafficking, including things like grooming, controlling behavior, exploitation, fraud, force, coercion, and violence. So that's what they'll learn, but let's talk about the why. Why is it so important for young people to be able to learn about abuse and sex trafficking prevention in the context of a school setting? So the most important thing is that Texas parents really support schools in being partners in providing information to help keep young people safe and healthy. In recent polling, we see that more than 3/4 of Texas parents support this kind of instruction. We want our young people to get messaging about health and safety from multiple trusted sources. We want this type of messaging to be coming from parents, from schools, from doctors. Hearing this type of messaging reiterated in a consistent way makes it more likely that it will reach our kids. As a mom, I know that I can tell my kids one thing and they may or may not hear it, but if they hear that same thing from their favorite teacher, it's even more likely to land. And we know that if we don't provide this information from reliable adults, kids will go online to fill in the blanks, and they might not be going online to safe spaces that will provide reliable information. Finally, we know that providing accurate information and reducing misinformation is a really important component of keeping our kids safe and healthy. So one important things for parents to know about health education, sexual health education, abuse prevention, and sex trafficking prevention instruction is that they need to provide a permission slip for their child to get this information. So Texas is the only state in the nation that requires written parent consent or opt-in order for students to receive instruction on abuse prevention or sex trafficking prevention. If your kid's backpack is anything like my kid's backpack, it can be easy to lose track of this paperwork or these forms. So it's really important to keep an eye out for it, to know when these permission slips might be coming, to sign them and make sure they make it back to the classroom. This is concerning because we know that not all kids have parents who are very engaged with their instructional materials. And the risk is that some of these kids who need this information the most might be the least likely to be able to get their paperwork back in. So as a parent, What can you do to help keep your kids healthy and safe and reduce their risk of sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, or other types of trafficking? The absolute most important thing that you can do is have open and honest conversations with your child from an early age. Things like teaching anatomically correct names for body parts, not shying away from conversations about things like healthy relationships, and just being a trusted adult that they can turn to will really improve that relationship and make it more likely that they'll turn to you instead of the internet if they have questions or if they feel at risk. If your child goes to a public or a charter school in Texas, you can review the health education curricula that your child will be learning from ahead of time. State law gives every parent the right to review this curricula. You can review it at your child's home campus. If your school is using open source materials, you can ask your school to email you a link. You can review it. You can make sure that it's something that you want your child participating in. And then, this is the important part, make sure you sign that permission slip to opt your child into lessons. And then, as your child is learning this content, be a trusted adult that they can talk to about it. Ask questions about what they learned in health class that day and what they thought about it. See if they have any additional questions that they want to talk about with you. You can really help reiterate those messages that they're learning about in school. If you have a child who's online, there are a lot of safety tools out there that you can use to monitor online conversations or prevent inappropriate content from reaching your child's device. And I know we'll talk about that more in the panel later on in this session. Just throughout, you can ask your child open-ended questions to check their understanding of these topics and check what thoughts they have. And again, we can't say this enough, be a trusted adult that they can turn to. Kids want to be able to talk to their parents or other trusted adults in their life about these topics, and you can really make a difference by being that person. Parents have a lot of rights and opportunities for involvement in their child's health education. I won't go through each of these points, but we have this slide here as a reference. But be familiar with what your child is learning and be an advocate within your community to make sure that your school is providing this information to your students.
All right. Thank you, Jen, and Healthy Futures of Texas organization for the informative presentation. There's so much to discuss, so let's get to our distinguished panel of experts to help us understand what we can do as parents and community members to tackle this growing problem. Alicia, in Jen's video, we heard some myths. Can you define human trafficking and also share some of the most subtle or overlooked red flags that parents and students should be aware of?
Thank you, Melinda. Human trafficking, and when I'm just talking with my girlfriends and other moms, is just this simple form of forced or even tricked or coercion into situations to where they're exploited for things like labor or sex. Traffickers take so much control over someone's life, they often use manipulation, threats, or even physical force. So when we're looking at our kiddos, we need to look for these signs. I came up with 10 of them, and I'm sure that there's so many more. Sudden behaviors or personality changes. So whether someone becomes extremely withdrawn, anxious, secretive, and starts isolating themselves from family and friends, it's an indication that someone is speaking to them that's unhealthy and that we need to be alarmed and start asking some questions. Unexplained possessions or access to money, especially if you know that this family doesn't really have access to a lot of lofty, expensive new clothes and tech and jewelry and cash, that they can't really explain where they obtained these items. Change in online behavior or social media use. We know that kids are going to be on social media, and we know that they're going to be on the internet, but how are they getting more frequent? How frequently are they on their phone? Are they more secretive, late night online conversations? Changes in their privacy settings and online habits drastically show you that these are red flags. New or much older friends. Traffickers can use their peers or people that are slightly older to recruit. Hyper awareness or paranoia about being watched. We see this a lot in the safe homes. where victims are in a state of constant surveillance or fear. They feel like someone is watching them. They're constantly checking over their shoulder. You might even liken it to PTSD from someone that's come back from being in war. And then unusual or vague school attendance. Oftentimes they're missing out on school. Their trafficker is having them stop participating in extracurricular activities. Physical signs of fatigue or neglect. You may think, bruises or physical harm. These are going to be signs which they can be, but often you can look for fatigue or neglect in there, or hygiene or unusual weight loss. Scripts or rehearsed responses. If young people have this, they're overly rehearsed when answering questions, especially about new friends, relationships, or their whereabouts. Sudden fear or reluctance to go home or certain places. If a student suddenly avoids specific places and shows a reluctance to go home without a clear reason, it could indicate that they're avoiding someone who's pressuring them or exploiting them. And finally, using language associated with exploitation, phrases like my boss, manager, or referring to themselves in a way like they owe someone can be subtle indicators. One of the language I actually heard, I think that's one of the most extreme cases, that she referred to her trafficker as her owner. So we all need to be looking out for these signs. And when we're approaching them, make sure that we're approaching them with a caring and non-judgmental response, so we can open that conversation so they do feel safe about sharing what's happening to them.
Wow, great information. All right, so Stephanie, we're going to move on to you. How is this issue showing up in schools and school districts, and what is in place to support victims?
Yeah, I really appreciate what Alicia was saying, because if you think of those 10 things that she mentioned, when teachers, counselors, administrators, coaches, when they get to know their students and they can see that change in behavior, that is something that will often alert us to something that's going on. And so really as a broad look at it, we try to be really mindful when we're doing things like enrolling students. It's not uncommon for students to enroll with a guardian that might not be a parent, but sometimes just asking a lot more questions and getting to know the family. And that may be something that alerts us to some social service needs, but sometimes getting to know the family, we come to just learn some things that would cause us to follow up with the student and try to understand a little bit more about their arrangement, how they got to us. So that's absolutely something that's happened in Frisco. And that may be their second placement after they've been trafficked, and then maybe now they are with someone safe, or perhaps they're with someone unsafe right now. And as we get to know that situation, we work with law enforcement just to understand their current guardian arrangement. And so that's something we've seen. The other thing that I would say is, again, and Alicia mentioned this, sometimes students wanting to leave school, and just understanding why. Maybe they're not being, or their attendance, and understanding more about what's going on. And so we have a mission in our district to know every student by name and need, but I would say that's the mission of every educator. And so really being committed to that and getting to know your students allows you to see that change in behavior, and just ask a lot of questions about what's going on. In terms of support for victims, I think it's very personalized. Sometimes they're currently in a situation, and then sometimes they're in transition. And so you're really trying to support that person. Maybe the things you would first think about, like counseling resources, trauma-informed care for the people working with them. But what we find is it's a lot of social services. Maybe there was something in their environment that that happened, and now maybe they're transitioned to a situation now, and they may or may not have medical insurance, or they may or may not have some of the other medical care that they need. And so we really work on the social services end for that. And then just people that specialize in treating young people who've been the victims of trafficking.
Thank you, Stephanie. Joseph, could you help us better understand the difference between human trafficking and exploitation? And then also talk to us about how social media and other technologies have impacted your work.
Yeah, so human trafficking and exploitation get conflated a lot, right? Um, if you're being trafficked, you're being exploited. There's no doubt about that. But if you're being exploited, you're not necessarily being trafficked. And we see a lot of, particularly in law enforcement, I don't know why, but people peripheral, generally kind of wanting that this person was trafficked. And I can think of one case I had where a mother kept trying to find reasons why her daughter was being trafficked. She was absolutely being exploited. There was no doubt. But she would find things like, well, maybe the fact that the man felt good about this was his payment for this, and therefore he's trafficking her. And I'm like, wait a minute, this just doesn't make any sense at all. So I think we really need to let things be what they are, because especially in sex crimes, they're horrendous no matter how you look at it, right? So if they're being trafficked, they're without a doubt being exploited. If they're being exploited, whether that be sexually, financially, or in any other form, it's bad. Let it be bad and let it be what it is. When we look at social media, the first thing I tell parents is, if you have a child that has a cell phone, take it and put it in a microwave for 30 seconds before submerging it in water. Um, Social media has made life, particularly in child abuse and human trafficking, difficult but super easy in its own right, right? The internet is a double-edged sword. What we do is use the internet to find you. That's how we identify you. That's how we exploit your exploiters. So, when we look at trafficking, the overwhelming majority of recruitment comes from social media, right? It's not coming from the boogeyman kidnapping kids. It's coming from the boogeyman coming through Instagram at 2 a.m. telling a young lady that she's beautiful. So it's it's perpetuating the trafficking, it's perpetuating the exploitation, but it's also making our job slightly easier, because now I have that digital trail to be able to follow you. If I do the right things in my investigation, I now have the ability to watch in real time what's happening and what's being said. So it's been a huge impact. The explosion of the apps that have come over the last 5, 6, 7 years has just made it extremely broad in what we have to be looking for. But yeah, it also, in some sense, from the law enforcement side, it has its difficulties, but it has its benefits as well.
Right. Thank you, Joseph. Jen, if I can come back to you, what are some ways that parents can be involved in school-based efforts to prevent trafficking?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my mind, it really comes down to education and to resources. So when we look at education for young people, and I know I already have talked about this for a few minutes, but parents have a lot of ways that state law lets them be involved in the health curriculum that their school is teaching. So parents can attend meetings of the School Health Advisory Council, or SHAC, which is a volunteer group that's charged with making recommendations on curricula about abuse prevention, including trafficking. Parents can be really instrumental in making sure that their schools are teaching these topics that they're required under state law to teach, but we know that a lot of, especially smaller districts, have logistical barriers to implementation and just aren't teaching it. And we really want parents to be engaged with the curriculum. Again, state law requires schools to provide parents with review copies of curriculum. So we really encourage parents to go out, read that curriculum that their child will be learning from, make sure that you're okay with it, and then make sure that permission slip gets back to the school so you can ensure that your child is actually getting this information from reliable and trusted sources, and then talk with them as they're going through this. And we also want teachers to have the information that they need, so parents can work with their districts to encourage them to provide training for their teachers, for their counselors, for the folks that work with young people. Trafficking, typic and exploitation in general very frequently involves young people who have other vulnerabilities, right? So they might be in the foster care system, they might be, runaways or homeless. They may have difficult immigration situations. So we really want schools to have the resources that they need to serve these young folks who are vulnerable, who may be at special risks. So things like a really robust program to work with their youth who are in the foster care system and make sure that they're providing wraparound services. I know that we ask a lot of our schools nowadays, right? And we don't just ask our schools to be teachers, we ask them to be therapists and counselors and social service providers and all of these other things. I know that we're overburdening schools to some degree, but they can provide so much to help keep our kids safe.
Thank you, Jen. That's great additional information. Stephanie, we have an audience question for you. Drawing upon your expertise in child development, at what age should parents start speaking to their children about the dangers of human trafficking?
Yeah, I love this question because when you look at the things that we're required to teach in schools, there's ages where certain topics pop up. So Jen did such a great job talking about the things that start in middle school. But one of the things I would really encourage is, they're never too young to talk about making good choices. They're never too young to talk about being safe. They're never too young to talk about using their voice and speaking up. So
Mm.
I would say they're never too young and never waste an opportunity. And so I think it's kind of hard sometimes as a parent because it can become a matrix. And so I would maybe rather say keeping the open dialogue, like Jen mentioned, and remembering if they're online, then they're not too young because they have to be safe. So if they're 4 and playing Roblox, they're not too young. Like they have to know. So open dialogue and never too young to start talking about making safe choices. But then the other thing I would add to that is never waste a story or an opportunity. If you hear about a news story, bring it up with your kids and talk about it. If you hear about something in your community, bring it up to your kids and talk about it. Because you're encouraging that open dialogue. I think you're encouraging a non-judgmental place for them to know that you're a trusted adult. But you're also using those other opportunities to expose them to this is a real thing that happens. How would you manage that? Right. And I can think about my own daughter. I remember going to an NBA game not too long ago, and she was texting with a friend and they wanted to meet up just right in between the sections. And I was like, yeah, I'll go with y'all and I'll just make sure, and she's like, no, we're fine. And I was like, that's fine, but I'll go with you. She's like, we're fine. And I was like, I'm going with you. Here's what happened a year ago in this exact same arena. I am going to make sure I have eyes on you and I trust you, and I'll stay just back enough so you can be cool. But I am going to have eyes on you, and I need you to know I have eyes on you, and I need you to be safe. And what was so funny is that little girl's dad had actually done the exact same thing. And we kind of laughed about it and kind of stood to the side. And I was like, I just had to tell her. And he said, I just told her the same thing. So, I think just being really honest with kids and your kids and talk about things as they come up. And I think it makes them I think it also makes them very situationally aware. And I think that's a lost art sometimes is teaching our kids situational awareness because that's about human trafficking, but that's about a lot of other topics too. And so anytime we can take advantage of just walking alongside our kids in life, and developing that situational awareness and greater commitment to safety, I think we're better off. And so I don't think there's really an age for that. I think we do that when they're 3 at the playground, you know.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, Stephanie. It's super helpful. Jen, in your video, you mentioned that parents should try to be one of those several trusted adults. What other advice can you give parents and guardians?
Yeah, so parents and guardians play such an important role in shaping, everything about their children. And I know for parents, it can feel really awkward and uncomfortable to have some of these conversations, whether it's about exploitation, whether it's about things like healthy relationships or sexual health in general. So the best advice I have is we don't just have one talk, right? I don't think I've ever told my children one time and had it sink in all the way. We have a series of talks with our kids, so it's lots of tiny little moments where we just open up a conversation about, oh, that's not a healthy relationship, right? That's not what it looks like, or oh, that's a risk right there. Um, and these talks might last for 30 seconds, but they compound over time, and that's really how we instill the sense of safety and these values into our kids. And we start those talks from a very, very early age. From the time my kids were toddlers, they knew the names of their body parts so that, they could make an outcry if they needed to. They understand, who's allowed to touch them. And also teaching kids about consent from a very early age, right? And we're not talking about sex at this point. We're just talking about being in charge of your own body. So kids might learn that if they don't want to give somebody a hug, they can give them a high five instead, and that's fine. But they're in charge of their body and they can stop anything that makes them feel uncomfortable. Um, and also, as parents, I think it's really important that our kids see a model of what a healthy and respectful relationship looks like. If your kids see their parents treating each other with respect and with dignity, they'll grow up learning to expect that for themselves. And that's a really important factor in helping preventing them from being exploited. And if you're not the parent, you can still support other kids in learning what respect and dignity look like, in being an open source of trusted information, and really just encouraging them to kind of have that sense of self-worth.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Joseph, let's talk about your specialty, law enforcement. How are schools and districts collaborating with law enforcement, social service agencies, and other community partners to address human trafficking?
Yeah, so that comes in a multitude of different ways, right? When we talk about child abuse investigations as a whole, for those that aren't familiar with it, we have what's called the multidisciplinary team approach to child abuse. So that is social services. In Texas, that's child protective services, law enforcement, prosecutors, medical. It's everybody staffing these cases and coming together to really kind of evaluate each case for what it's worth. That's been proven to work since the early 1980s. We do that a lot. We should be doing it more, but we do it quite a bit in human trafficking investigations. If it's a juvenile, it generally gets staffed that way from the law enforcement side. Um, when we're looking at these social service organizations, they're huge, right? When we see what law enforcement can do, it's very limited. We're equipped to arrest people for committing crimes, and that's really about it. We're not the agencies that are here for the long-term um, uh, kind of best practices when it comes to victims of trafficking. I wish we were, but we're just not. That's not what we're equipped for. So having schools involved, right? We have schools heavily involved in our task forces. Few reasons for that. Why? Truant kids, right? The kids that are not sitting in class every day are the ones that are at higher vulnerability, right? So having that direct line of communication with the school districts. Um, Going back to what was said earlier, I always find the kind of things that we're looking for when it comes to kids interesting, like the signs and symptoms, because if I don't know the kid, I don't know what the signs and symptoms are, right? But who knows the kid better than anybody other than the parent? It's the person who spends just as much time with our kids as we do. So having that involvement from the school, hopefully they're in school districts where, for me and my kid as an example, I'll get just a text or an email from a teacher that's like, hey, I don't know what's going on, but something's not right with John today, right? Like it may be just that he's having a bad day, but just so you know. And for me, that really is heavy involvement with the school. Our social service agencies, right? If we have victims of trafficking, maybe they're not going to school the way they should be. Having, In Texas, the justice of the peace doing truancy court, making those kids go to school. I've seen one JP that made the parents actually walk the kids to each class by court order. Like, good on them. If there is some kind of addiction issues, law enforcement's not equipped for that. That is for those agencies. Our child welfare system, we're not equipped for that. So, who's looking out for the best interest of the child? It needs to be those agencies that have that ability to do that. Having all those community partnerships, medical, we forget about that. Dental, not every kid gets to go get a toothache fixed, and that's a horrific thing for those that have ever had one. Having just the wraparound service of the community for each kid through that kind of multidisciplinary team approach to it really benefits everybody, because we tend to point the finger at the cops for not making arrests or not doing this and that. But if we have that wraparound care for these kiddos, it's going to make not only the law enforcement investigation that much easier and effective, but it's going to make the long-term, hopefully, accountability of the trafficker and exploiter that much stronger. But then at the end, really the most important is getting that youth out of that situation and doing what we can to make them a healthier kiddo for the long term is really the main goal.
All right. Thank you, Joseph. That is great information. Alicia, you undoubtedly hear heart-wrenching stories through the Treasured Vessels Foundation. Can you share the correlation between trafficking and mental health?
Yeah, the correlation is really significant. As the trauma you can imagine after hearing all the panelists speak about, the trauma can be so severe, and the mental health impact can be a lifetime of healing and recovery. One of the assessments that we do when the girls come into the safe house is we do an adverse childhood experiences assessment. And it's questions that's 0 to 10. Every time they answer yes, they get a tick mark for yes, my parents have been divorced, or yes, someone in my household has gone to jail. And I would encourage everybody to look those up, because once you identify if a young person in your school is scoring really high, their vulnerability is so much higher than someone that scores low. On average, our girls are scoring an 8.6 out of 10. That's so extreme. We see young ladies come into the safe house with PTSD, a lot of times complex PTSD, meaning that PTSD has been compounded, that trauma has been compounded over years. Suicidal ideation and depression. The depression can be so severe that suicidal ideation is daily, sometimes hourly. The rates of suicide attempts are so alarmingly high for these victims. Anxiety and panic disorders, substance abuse and addiction. Traffickers can use substances as a control tactic to keep them dependent on the trafficker, but then also they can use substances, as we can imagine, to numb from the pain and the trauma. And then dissociative disorders. We have experienced young ladies that have a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. A third of our residents have experienced multiple personalities. That's what we kind of commonly know on the streets as dissociative identity disorder. It is when their thoughts and feelings and the sense of identity, they use it as a coping mechanism. So it's a very, very complicated disorder, and it takes a very long time to heal from that. Oftentimes they may not even heal at all completely in their lifetime. Attachment and trust issues. It's hard to build healthy relationships when you've never had a healthy relationship modeled for you and you've experienced these things. So we see this in our young people. As you see this, why is it such a cycle? Why does she keep going back to him? Why does it just seem like a magnet? Well, there's a lot of attachment and trust issues, and physical health and psychosomatic conditions. When the young ladies come into the safe house, they have a lot of GI disorders. They have chronic pain. They have seen the chiropractor. They're on tons of medications. They're not sleeping through the night. So it's really a lot of disordered eating that we have to work through and unpack.
That's hard to hear. Thank you for sharing that information, Alicia. Stephanie, what practices or resources are school districts putting in place to identify and support our most at-risk youth?
Yeah, when we use the term at risk in schools, it's a very broad umbrella. And so with that broad umbrella, we look for some systematic triggers. So grades, attendance, behavior. Those would be things that would present themselves in the data, maybe before a student might present something, but those are usually helpful for us to know that something's going on. What we've started to introduce in terms of training, again, especially for our counselors to be looking for signs in young people, and Alicia spoke to this a little bit, but maybe like unkept hygiene, but maybe a couple of items that they own that are very high dollar, like some of those incongruencies maybe. So being mindful of that, and then just getting to know our students and our families. I can think of one student specifically that had met someone online, and they had gotten picked up through an agreed upon meetup, and they were going to be sold the next day, had a buyer ready. And that was a student who might not have presented with some of that data. But now knowing that and supporting them, that was very traumatic and a huge surprise to them, that that's how it ended. So that one's more like cyber safety. I can think of another family where the two girls have come here from out of country because they were trafficked here by their uncle, but they're now with their mom. And so, you know, again, a lot of Medicaid application, medical care, getting them resources because mom's working to support that whole family now financially. So no two situations are exactly alike. But I think being aware of the social services that are available in our district, but also in our county, there really are a lot of county resources. Sometimes maybe people aren't aware of, but understanding your community where you're at and the options that you have, and then getting to know those individual families, it's so critical. And then knowing the organizations that you have, like Treasured Vessels, or just getting them a referral. I mean, it's obviously something far beyond what a school could handle alone, but it is absolutely something, to borrow from what Joseph said, just a multidisciplinary team for that to at least start, and us take a lot of responsibility in schools for at least getting them referred, and then supporting them along the way, so that they do have some control over their future.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Joseph, what support services are available to victims and survivors of human trafficking?
Yeah, so that's a very broad question, and it depends really on where you're at, right? One of the most important thing is not what support services are there, but what are meaningful support services, right?
Hmm.
I could provide you services all day. If they're not meaningful, it doesn't matter. I see a lot where organizations may bring, backpack with toothpaste. Well, that's great. It doesn't solve the problem, right? Um, Looking at that, it really has to be customized to each individual trafficking survivor. We've got these boxes where we like to put them and be like, well, this is how we fix the problem. But if that doesn't fix the problem for that particular person, it does absolutely nothing. As an example, I toured a safe house that was just for very short-term care, and it was locked down like Fort Knox. And then on the inside, it was this like frou-frou whatever. And truth be told, you take an inner city kid and put them in a room that they've never had some of these things, they're not going to stay there long, right? And I don't know that this particular place has even had anybody there for longer than probably an hour. Um, that's those support services really have to be customized and they have to be fluid. Nobody has the right answer, right? We just don't. Simply because every single one is going to be different. It may be that this kid, um, one thing we can all agree on, right, is the best thing for them is to not be trafficked. Like that one we can agree on. But beyond that, I may look at a 16-year-old and say, hey, right now you need somewhere to sleep. And she may say, right
Mm.
now I need somewhere to go get medical treatment. Or I may tell the next one, right now you need medical treatment, and she may say, no, I need somewhere to sleep. So we really have to kind of customize that. Obviously, in the larger metro areas, there's much more um, availability for different types of services. Mental health is going to be huge, right? Like Alicia said, I don't even know a single survivor that doesn't have complex PTSD, right? And talk therapy ain't going to work. When we look at again, medical, right? You may have more services in larger jurisdictions. For us here in Waco, they do free exams for a lot of these women that we're getting right off of right, like literally in the middle of sting operations. That's going to be huge. Having the ability to have safe and sane exams wherever you are. Um, Advocates, organizations that provide food, right? I mean, sometimes people eat very, very well. Sometimes they don't. Just the availability is really going to depend on where you're at. If you're in a more rural jurisdiction, just look to the bigger towns around you. I don't know of any that are going to say no. It's too much to drive an hour to get out to you, right? So definitely, acquaint yourself. If you don't have something locally, I would always start with a women's shelter, right? Those shelters, the child advocacy centers, they're always going to know who to direct you to um, for that aftercare. So, reach out to those organizations and familiarize yourself with it before you have an issue. The last thing you want to do is to be sitting there with a kiddo that's being trafficked or an adult that's being trafficked and try to figure it out and build that plane while you're flying. It's way best to have that plane built before you take off.
Yeah, great. That's very insightful. Thank you, Joseph. This is the last question we have time for. And Alicia, I'm going to come back to you. What role can community members play in supporting survivors?
Wow. I feel like one of the things is listening and becoming, raising awareness, right? Becoming educated on what trafficking is, what it isn't, what abuse is, being familiar about what is going on in our own backyard. Really, knowledge is truly the power in this sense. Provide practical resources. Survivors often need essential things like housing, transportation, job training, and education. Support your local shelters and nonprofits. Our organization, as many around the country, we run on a really tight budget, and you can imagine the amount of support these individuals need. So volunteering, fundraising, and simply spreading the word about what the organizations are doing, and what lane that we are in to help survivors. Like Joseph mentioned, there are so many different lanes and so many different ways that you can fit in with your gifts and your talents and your treasures. Shelters, we often need time assistance with daily task mentoring, tutoring, or skill building programs. In our home, the girls it is a home, so they're learning to deep clean sometimes for the very first time. So having a couple of older seniored women in the coming in and coming alongside and teaching them how to do that is so helpful, and it's also therapeutic. Educate schools and youth programs, just like we're doing now, not only from a PTA, but also sports clubs, other youth organizations where you have, even a more intimate setting with young people, offering employment opportunities to survivors. If you can imagine, there's a lot of barriers that survivors can face when going back into the workplace, especially if there's gaps in employment and lack of experience. And lobby for policy changes. Engaging in local and national advocacy efforts can push for stronger anti-trafficking policies, funding for survivor services, and harsher penalties for traffickers. Foster safe and inclusive spaces. There is a great deal of shame that comes along with abuse, trafficking, sexual exploitation. And so creating a safe space for someone to be able to share their experiences, find a support group, wellness centers. These spaces are a way for them to connect, because we know that connection and community bring healing. And then be a supportive listener and ally. Stay informed and take action. I think when the community is more supportive and can come alongside survivors and offer compassion and practical resources, as mentioned on this webinar today, that we can strengthen our survivors' ability to heal. And then we can also build a community that's more resistant to traffickers, making it more difficult for them to operate undetected.
Right. Well, with that, we are out of time. I'm amazed at the amount of critical information we have covered, including the realities of human trafficking. We explored the different forms of trafficking and the vulnerabilities that can make people susceptible. Identifying the red flags, we learned how to recognize warning signs of potential trafficking situations, both online and in person. Empowering our communities. We discuss strategies to keep our young people safe, make informed decisions, and tips on how to intervene if we suspect trafficking. And then resources and support. We learn more about available resources and support for victims, survivors, and those seeking help. So right now, let's take a look at the Texas PTA website to see where the recording and all of these resources will live for future reference. Right. So there, all the information is going to be there, and we'll have a link in the chat to give you guys so that you can get to that information and be able to then share this in your communities, at your PTA meetings or wherever, to get information out to the people that need it to make change. So as we see, human trafficking is an overwhelming global issue, but by working together, we can make a difference in each of our communities. You may be wondering what you can do. Here are a few steps you can take. Stay informed, subscribe to reputable sources for updates on human trafficking prevention and resources. Spread awareness, share what you learned today with your families, friends, and colleagues. The more people who understand the signs, the more empowered we are to identify and report potential cases. Know the resources. Keep the hotlines and support organizations we will share in the chat readily available. If you suspect trafficking, don't hesitate to report it. And then Human Trafficking Awareness Month is in January, so please share in your communities and schools. Thank you to our audience for joining us today for this important conversation. We hope you found this conversation valuable and that you feel more informed and empowered. You can also see the additional resources we listed on the webpage. We hope you find those helpful. I want to give another special shout out to our expert panelists. Thank you, Jennifer Biendo, Alicia Bush, Dr. Stephanie Cook, and Joseph Scaramucci for spending this time with us and sharing your invaluable knowledge. Finally, I want to thank Heidi Picoy, Texas PTA's president-elect, for her support of this program, and bring back Jennifer Easley, Texas PTA president, for some final words.
Thank you, Melinda. As we conclude this important discussion on human trafficking, I really want to emphasize the profound impact this issue has on our communities and the individuals within them. Thank you again, Melinda, the Programs and Resources Committee, and Carrie Mays for organizing this event, and to our amazing panelists for sharing their valuable insights. The information shared today highlights the urgent need for us as PTA members to be informed advocates for the safety and well-being of our children. Human trafficking is a serious issue that affects people of all ages, and it's crucial we recognize the signs and take proactive steps to intervene. By educating ourselves, our families, and our communities, we can empower ourselves to protect vulnerable individuals and support survivors. Together, we can raise awareness, advocate for stronger protections, and support organizations that provide vital services to victims. So thank you for your attention and dedication to making a difference. Through our collective efforts, we can create a safer and more just world for everyone. Take care.
All right. Thank you, guys.